The Bucks finished with a 60-22 record last year under first-year head coach Mike Budenholzer, which represented a 16-win improvement over the year before and pushed themselves into legitimate title contention. But unfortunately for them, this roster experienced a large amount of roster turnover when you consider how successful they were the year before. But even with that, they do still have the reigning MVP in Giannis and plenty of pieces around him that put them, in my opinion, still well within championship contention for this upcoming season. But let's go ahead and review their offseason, and first up in terms of additions is Wes Matthews. And this is actually a really important player for this team to bring in. Once you look at some of their subtractions, they definitely needed some help at the 2 and the 3 spots, and Wes Matthews is going to be exactly the kind of player that this team needs. Isn't going to be a high usage guy in terms of a guy that needs the basketball, needs to be a playmaker to be effective. He's going to be an off the ball shooter. He's going to be a defender. Not as good as he has been throughout his career at this point, given the fact that he had the Achilles injury a couple years ago, and then his age obviously is getting up there as well. But he's going to be productive. He's going to be able to knock down shots. And even though, like I said, he won't be as good of a defender now as he used to be, still very, very useful and helpful for this Bucks team. Next up in terms of additions is Kyle Korver, who obviously had a ton of success throughout his career, but most specifically in his time in Atlanta when Mike Budenholzer was there, when that team won 60 games. And he's going to be a big part of this team as well. Obviously as a shooter, as someone that can play on the wing, not going to be a very good defender, but is going to fit so well in this system that Budenholzer has with the Bucks, and just being a really good floor spacer for this team. Got him on a very cheap deal. There was a lot of competition for who was going to bring him in once he was waived, and now that he is in Milwaukee, I think it's going to be a good season for him and a good addition for this team. Next up now is Dragan Bender, and there's really not a ton to say about this guy. Former top 5 pick, was supposed to be really good in Phoenix, just never really developed, and now finds himself on a 2-year minimum deal with the Bucks just 4 or 5 years after he was initially drafted. Could end up being something for them as some depth at the 5 spot or the 4 spot potentially long term. Right now though, really not expecting a ton from him because this team has plenty of other options at the 5 spot. Most specifically, the last addition, Robin Lopez, obviously Brook Lopez's brother, has had some productive seasons over the last couple of years, but has been on some bad teams, so people don't really pay that much attention to him. Provides good energy, just your typical good front court depth player, rebounder, finisher inside, and provides energy for this team. Moving on now to what is, in my opinion, the much more interesting part of the Milwaukee Bucks offseason, and that is their subtractions. The first is the biggest one, in my opinion, and that is Malcolm Brogdon, who finally had a relatively healthy season last year. He's always been good whenever he's been able to be on the floor, but that's been the main struggle for him, is just the fact that he has dealt with so many injuries to this point in his career. Really good playmaker, kind of combo guard, can shoot off the ball, can make plays on the ball, a pretty good defender as well. Ended up in Indiana this offseason via a sign and trade, and really going into this offseason, this was something that I talked about during the year last year. The Bucks were going to have to make some decisions about who they did and did not want to keep because they had so many expiring contracts. Even guys like Eric Bledsoe that were signed during the season, he would have been a 2019 free agent as well had they not signed him to an extension. So basically every important player on their roster other than Giannis was a free agent this offseason, and they had to make some choices about which ones not to keep, and ultimately Brogdon was one of the guys that they chose not to bring back. So they're certainly going to miss him, but it's really important that they brought in guys like Korver and Matthews that obviously aren't going to provide the same level of playmaking, but are going to provide them depth at the 2 and 3 spots and knock down some shots off the ball. Moving on now to another subtraction, and this one is Nikola Mirotic, who surprisingly ended up actually signing overseas with Barcelona, didn't even sign with another NBA team, and this was another guy that they traded for midseason last year that was going to be a 2019 free agent. They didn't really have the money to bring him back anyway after some of the other moves that they made, so it's not the end of the world at all that they ended up losing him. They would like to have him certainly, but when you look at their depth chart, they have plenty of depth at the 4 and 5 spots, plenty of guys that can shoot and space the floor for them. So even though they'd like to have Mirotic, it makes sense that they made the choice to let him go and eventually end up in Barcelona. And then last up in terms of subtractions, not really a significant one at all in my opinion, was Tony Snell, who was traded away in June, basically just for salary cap relief. He's a wing that can kind of shoot, can kind of defend, but has been up and down throughout his career. Not especially important for this team, again, considering that they did bring in some other options at the 2 and the 3 spots to kind of replace Brogdon and Snell. And so in summary, again, this was always going to be a relatively tough offseason for the Bucks, considering how successful they were last year with guys like Brook Lopez and Mirotic and Bledsoe before he signed his extension, and Brogdon and Chris Middleton. Literally every single significant player on their team, with the exception of guys that are on rookie contracts, as well as Ilyasova and Giannis, those are the only guys that weren't 2019 free agents, so it was always going to be tough for them. But personally, I think they did a really good job of not putting themselves in too much trouble in terms of the salary cap this year, as well as moving forward, anticipating what is probably going to be $250 million in total salary supermax for Giannis here pretty soon, and still putting together a team that can contend for the finals this year, in my opinion. So pretty solid job by them this offseason. Moving on now, let's talk about the depth chart. For starters, for me, I have Bledsoe, Middleton, Korver, Giannis, and Lopez. Off the bench, there's a ton of options here. Hill, Matthews, Connaughton, DiVincenzo, Ilyasova, Wilson, Lopez, as well as Bender. And the only place that it really gets kind of weird in the starting lineup and depth-wise as well is at the 3 spot when you have Korver and you have DiVincenzo. But realistically, this team can do so many different things at the 1 through 3 spots that it only looks a little bit weird on paper, and in the end, it won't be that much of an issue because they do have so much depth. Like, they could play Bledsoe and Hill together, slide Middleton down to the 3. They could play Wes Matthews at the 2 and slide Middleton down to the 3. Realistically, this team is going to play small a good amount of the time. They have a lot of options on the perimeter. So it's just on paper where you look and you're like, oh, Kyle Korver is going to start for this team, or DiVincenzo is going to start for this team. In the end, it really doesn't matter. Realistically, you could see Chris Middleton and Wes Matthews and Eric Bledsoe starting at the beginning of the year. Not a huge deal. The only thing that could be an issue for this team in terms of their backcourt, their 1 through 3 rotation, is the fact that they did lose Brogdon, which is a significant amount of secondary playmaking that this team has lost. And so now when you look at the roster, the only 2 guys that they really have, really 3 guys that they have that can create plays are obviously Giannis, Chris Middleton occasionally, and then Eric Bledsoe. And it was just nice when they had Malcolm Brogdon there as well to provide a little bit more playmaking on the ball and ball screens and things like that. Still not a huge fan of Eric Bledsoe, and I'm interested to see how he plays this season and how that impacts kind of their long-term contention goals. Obviously, Giannis is going to be there, is going to be providing a lot of the playmaking and scoring for this team. But in terms of things that I don't really like, I would like to see them have one more playmaker, but they do have plenty of options in the backcourt as off-ball guys. They're just going to be relying a lot on Bledsoe, Middleton, and Giannis. But in terms of things that I do like, obviously they have a ton of options at basically every position. I think this is the most players that I've put in the depth chart in any season preview that I've done to this point. And they also have a nice mix of veterans as well as younger guys at pretty much every position. Like, you've got DiVincenzo and Matthews, you've got Bender and Lopez, you've got Ilyasova and Wilson, you've got Connaughton and Matthews. Like, you've just got a nice little mix of younger guys and veteran guys that you can go to throughout the season. If maybe the veterans need a little bit of a rest, go with the younger guys, depending on who's playing better. At the end of the day, they just have a ton of options and a ton of depth, and that's one of my favorite things about this team, other than the fact that obviously they have some supremely talented players, the reigning MVP, and then Chris Middleton, and maybe Eric Bledsoe as well. Moving on now to some players to watch, and the first one, and the only one actually in this season preview, is going to be Donte DiVincenzo. And I was surprised that he didn't get very much run last year, but in hindsight, it kind of makes sense. This is a team that ended up winning 60 games, was an extremely successful regular season team, and was relatively close to making the finals as well. Was my pick to make the finals during the season out of the Eastern Conference last year. And so it kind of makes sense that a rookie in DiVincenzo didn't get a ton of run, but I think that he's a really talented player and someone that can certainly help this team. And if he gets more opportunities this year, which as you look at their depth chart earlier, it seems like they probably will give him some more opportunities, I think he could be really good as a shooter, as a little bit of a playmaker as well. Typically, Budenholzer is pretty good at developing their players, and I would be pretty surprised if he does not make a leap this year and become a relatively significant part of their rotation. So DiVincenzo is certainly a guy to keep an eye on for me. Moving on now to expectations and predictions. For me, expectations, it's very simple. This is a legitimate title contender in my mind. Even with the loss of Malcolm Brogdon, even with the loss of Nikola Mirotic, they brought in enough pieces that fit, that make sense on this team. They have enough depth, and they still have Giannis, obviously, that this team is a legitimate title contender, certainly a contender to make the finals. In terms of predictions, I've got them at slightly less wins than they did last year, because I do think that there's a couple of teams at the top of the Eastern Conference that are going to be really, really good and cause them some issues during the season, as well as I just don't think they're necessarily going to be pushing for as much regular season success, and they're going to be focusing a little bit more on the postseason and on the playoffs. I've got them at 56 to 59 wins, but still, in my opinion, one of the 5 best teams in the entire league. Giannis is going to be amazing once again this season. They're going to shoot a ton of threes. They're going to make a ton of threes, and they're just going to be a really nice, well-balanced team. I do have slight concerns on the defensive end in terms of their ability to match up in the postseason, but bringing in guys like Robin Lopez to protect the rim a little bit better than his brother Brook does, and having guys like Chris Middleton and Eric Bledsoe and Giannis are still good defenders as well. Just outside of that, I do have slight questions about their ability to put a really good 5-man group on the floor in the postseason, except unless they're going to be relying on guys like Wes Matthews to potentially be playing the 2, or DiVincenzo if he really steps up. It seems like maybe they're one guy short of putting together a really good starting group, which means that they could be making a trade mid-season. But regardless, even with the team that they have right now, I think they're one of the best 5 teams in the league, and I'm really looking forward to seeing them play this season. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.